1,000 years after the Battle of Ruusan on the mining asteroid colony of Polis Massa, a young boy named Luke was born on the eve of the rise of the Galactic Empire. Taken by the Jedi survivor Obi-Wan Kenobi to the desert planet of Tatooine to live in hiding from the eyes of the Sith, Luke would spend the next 19 years as a farmhand on his uncle's moisture farm, until Imperial brutality would take the lives of his aunt and uncle. Entering the tutelage of Kenobi, Luke was instrumental in not only rescuing the Alderaanian princess Leia Organa, but destroying the Death Star space station during the Battle of Yavin. 2 years afterwards, he would enter the tutelage of the former Jedi Grand Master Yoda at the behest of the spirit of Kenobi, abandoning his training to rescue his friends from the clutches of the Sith Lord Darth Vader. Luke would engage Vader throughout Cloud City's underlevel before being defeated. Then he learned a terrible truth. Anakin Skywalker, the man whose footsteps that Luke had been following, was the traitor who had butchered the old Jedi Order. Luke would eventually confront his father again before the Emperor aboard the second Death Star during the Battle of Endor, and after a fierce bout in the Death Star's throne room, Luke defeated his father, choosing to spare Vader's life, rejecting Palpatine's offer of Sith apprenticeship and provoking the Emperor's wrath. However, Luke was able to get through to his father, who sacrificed himself to slay the Dark Lord. However, this was not to be the end for Sidious, for he had prepared for even the possibility of his apprentice turning on him. A hidden cache of clone bodies on Biss allowed the Emperor to reincarnate himself and rebuild his power base. When Luke became aware of this threat and realized the significance and potential danger that it would bring upon the galaxy, he took an immense risk, infiltrating Sidious's inner circle by willingly submitting himself as Palpatine's Sith apprentice. Though Luke was almost lost to the darkness, thanks to his sister Leia, Luke was able to free himself from Palpatine's grasp, and Skywalker and his allies were able to corner and finally destroy Palpatine's spirit.
Born 102 years before the Battle of Yavin, Dooku, a young noble of Serennu, was inducted into the Jedi Order at a young age. Trained by Grand Master Yoda, Dooku quickly rose to prominence as one of the finest and most gifted swordsmen in the Order. However, during his time serving the Order, Dooku became disillusioned by the corruption of the Galactic Republic and inefficiencies of the Jedi Council. This combined with his departure shortly after the Naboo crisis due to finally breaking at the loss of his apprentice Qui-Gon Jinn. Not long after his departure, he was approached by the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Sidious, promised with the chance to bring about a new galactic rule that would bring peace and order. Dooku pledged himself to the Sith and was dubbed Darth Tyrannus. After 10 years of carrying out orders for Sidious, including orchestrating the creation of the clones, Count Dooku would become the leader of the emerging Confederacy of Independent Systems, a fraudulent puppet state created for the Sith Grand Plan. After leading the Separatists for 3 years during the Clone Wars, Dooku would face off against Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker one last time during the Battle of Coruscant, and subsequently was defeated by the Chosen One. However, much to his horror, Palpatine had betrayed Dooku and ordered Anakin to execute him. Dooku's death gave Sidious the opening he needed to separate Skywalker from his master and quietly corrupt him, eventually taking him as the newly minted Darth Vader, and fulfilling the Sith imperative by utterly destroying the Jedi Order, while Dooku would be remembered as little more than a failed revolutionary. For those of you who may be looking at me when it comes with this matchup, I have this to say to Deadponic.
Hold on. This whole operation was your idea.
As is evident based on the biographies, we are pitting Count Dooku against Luke Skywalker, specifically during the time of Dark Empire. And no, this is not in response to Jen Sarai and Evan's Dooku versus Malak collab. While the version of Luke as featured in classic expanded lore is by and far the superior version of the character, Grandmaster Luke is for all intents and purposes OP as fuck. Not only does this make Grandmaster Luke difficult to research due to the sheer amount of material available that it becomes headache-inducing, but it also makes him impossible to use in a regular matchup due to the number of fighters on his level being extremely small. By using Dark Empire era Luke, not only is the amount of material not as overwhelming, but you still get a highly developed character that isn't broken and isn't capable of simply stomping anybody he's put up against.
My analysis of Count Dooku will be drawn from Episode 2 and 3's film, novel, and comic adaptations, the Clone Wars micro-series, Dark Rendezvous, the Republic comics, Star Wars Bounty Hunter, Jango Fett open seasons, and other sources within the Clone Wars multimedia project. Supporting material will include The Jedi Path, the Book of Sith, the New Essential Chronology, the Complete Encyclopedia, the Essential Reader's Companion, the Essential Guide to the Force, the Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology, and the Essential Guide to Warfare. Although this analysis will mostly be stemmed from Legends continuity, specifically classic expanded universe material, I have decided to make use of TCW and its tie-in materials as another source for this analysis, as in spite of my personal issues with some aspects of Count Dooku's characterization within the show, his capabilities, technique, and style remain mostly consistent, with the show's only sin being that Lord Tyrannus is underpowered compared to his EU depictions. But in fairness, every TCW character suffers this problem. I would also like to say that while this will not be used as a source, the Tales of the Jedi miniseries will be used as a visual representation for describing his feats and techniques during portions of this analysis.
With that out of the way, let us begin. Count Dooku, Sith aristocrat, and Luke Skywalker, son of the Chosen One. If these two swordsmen were to meet in combat, who would win?
By the time of his death on board the Invisible Hand, Count Dooku was an 83-year-old human male who was in extremely good shape in spite of being a man of his years. Throughout his entire life, he had maintained a slender but imposing build, and utilized his Jedi training and Sith battle experience to preserve being a top-tier fighter in his golden years. Accounts have also presented that Dooku's age has rarely operated as a handicap, and even was stated to wear his 8 decades better than most humans would half his age. Dooku has also displayed very little dark side degradation, only suffering consistently from the slightly paler skin and rare occurrences of yellow eyes during heavier immersion in the dark side, though it is worth noting that the latter was only depicted in TCW. However, Dooku did admit that he suffered from degenerate effects in his advanced age, with the Count even admitting to suffering fatigue during his final confrontation with Kenobi and Skywalker on the Invisible Hand. As for physical augmentation, Dooku has displayed very impressive force enhancements. Strength-wise, Dooku was stated by many sources, including Sir Christopher Lee, to possess immense physical power, and it is shown through Dooku overriding Kenobi within a saberlock in their skirmish on Geonosis, stonewalled Asajj Ventress's Jar-Kai frenzy on more than one occasion with just one hand, and has even withstood the onslaught of General Grievous during their many sparring sessions. Dooku was also able to integrate physical techniques with his duels against other opponents, such as when he used the spinning side stamp to fold Skywalker, as well as doing a wheel kick on Kenobi's chin that was so strong it caused a crack-like sound to occur and knocked Kenobi all the way down the stairs, with even a realistic hope that it could have broken his neck. However, it is noted in the novel that Dooku was physically the weakest out of the 3 fighters, with Dooku even stating that he could not meet Skywalker's power blows strength to strength, and having to drain massive amounts of force reserves just to prevent the Chosen One from cutting him in half. Dooku's speed was held at a similar level as his strength. Dooku has consistently displayed that he can more than keep up with even the best opponents of his era. Dooku was also showcased to be able to keep up with the speed of Yoda's Ataro Whirlwind for a limited amount of time, and was even able to score hits on Yoda during their second fight on Vajun, though it is worth noting Dooku was enhanced by a Darkside Nexus during the latter engagement. However, Dooku was notably shaken by the speed of Anakin and Obi-Wan, with the latter being regarded by Dooku for having a bewilderingly fast defense. In terms of stamina, Dooku's capabilities were highly dependent on circumstances. Against younger but far weaker Jedi, Dooku had no issue within a prolonged engagement due to the massive amount of force reserves he could draw on, which allowed him to effectively compensate for his advanced years. However, when going against opponents of equal or near equal power levels, his stamina had more noticeable gaps. Within both of his engagements with Yoda, Dooku was visibly taxed and exhausted, with his bout on Vajun even describing the Count as sweating after his fight with Yoda. Dooku has also admitted within the Revenge of the Sith novelization that his stamina was his weakest attribute, and had to consistently drain force reserves just to withstand Kenobi and Skywalker. Dooku has even admitted that simply blocking Anakin's strikes required him to draw on more power than what he needed to throw Kenobi across the room. In terms of durability, Dooku's feats were limited due to having a combat advantage in most of his fights. However, he was able to withstand multiple physical blows such as punches, kicks, and attempted strangulations from Anakin, who was stated in the Revenge of the Sith novel to have ended up becoming the physically strongest Jedi of his era. In terms of attire, Dooku had worn many outfits during his life, though this matchup shall be accounting for his main attire he has worn through the Clone Wars and during the time of his death. Dooku had worn a traditional Saranian close-fitted tunic, with trousers that were typically colored in various black and brown shades depending on the art style, high leather and rank boots, and a utility belt similar to those that were worn by Jedi. Dooku also had sported a near-floor brown cape to announce his authority, with the only combat feature of the cape being that it was made out of a flexible armor-weaving line that enabled him to dissipate blaster bolts and even provided a minuscule amount of protection against lightsabers. In conclusion, Count Dooku was a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. He wasn't stronger, faster, or as enduring as the absolute best physical Jedi and Sith, but he did possess the ability to contend with them, and anyone below top-tier level would be met with an extremely hard time by the Count. However, the Count has suffered with tight battles due to his advanced age, and in spite of how fit and versatile he is still past his prime.
Luke Skywalker was also a human male, approximately 26 years of age by the time of the conflict with the reborn Emperor. At 6'2", Luke was a mere ant compared to his father, though he shared Anakin's blonde hair and athletic physique. His upbringing on a harsh planet as a farmhand prepared him for handling extreme conditions. His most telling feat in this regard was his ability to survive a blizzard on Hoth long enough for help to arrive, in addition to surviving Emperor Palpatine's Force Lightning barrage for an extended time. Luke was further distinguished by a prosthetic hand, the original having been amputated during his confrontation with Vader on Bespin. Though Luke took to wearing a black glove to conceal the hand when it became damaged, it was merely cosmetic in function, and it could be used as an effective bludgeon. His outfit during his tenure as Palpatine's apprentice was essentially a stripped-back version of the bodysuit worn by Vader, which included gauntlets, greaves, and a codpiece, and was otherwise nondescript. As a physical combatant, Luke initially balanced his attributes across the board in order to be as flexible as possible, but later retooled himself towards strength in order to better combat Vader. His reflexes were also highly refined, developing as a bush pilot on Tatooine, and later being able to deflect laser cannon fire from a 7-4Z speeder bike traveling towards him at top speed. Imperial speeder bikes, I would like to point out, have a max speed of up to 500 miles per hour, which to put into real-life context is faster than a Japanese bullet train and a Formula 1 race car, whose speeds clock in at 350 miles per hour, making Luke's reaction time at the very least superhuman, even among Jedi standards. This was reinforced by his enhanced agility and dexterity, which gave him a level of fine control and enabled him to perform superhuman acrobatics. All in all, Luke Skywalker was the ideal human specimen at the prime of his life.
This conclusion is very obvious. Count Dooku retains the strength, agility, and dexterity of a middle-aged man, but his lackluster stamina and heavy reliance on force enhancements to compensate for his advanced age puts him at a serious disadvantage against his opponent.
By contrast, not only is Luke much younger than Dooku, but he can match his physical traits in every way. He can endure anything short of a fatal blow. His agility is superior and his strength is equivalent to Darth Vader's, making him arguably the stronger combatant. And he has superior stamina, meaning he can engage Dooku reliably by outperforming him should the fight turn into a slugging match. Luke Skywalker gets the physical edge.
During his young years within the Jedi Order, Dooku was the most gifted student of his generation and was a natural prodigy with a lightsaber. Taking full advantage of his gifts, Dooku developed to become one of the greatest lightsaber duelists in the history of the Jedi Order, and served as a remarkable lightsaber instructor. However, after his departure from the Jedi Order and subsequent fall to the dark side, Dooku's combat gifts would be turned against the Jedi Order, and would be responsible for the deaths of many Jedi within his era. Dooku's chosen fighting style was Form 2 Makashi, which was the second classical form of Jedi lightsaber combat. Makashi was an ancient fencing style that was specifically designed for lightsaber dueling. For a time, Form 2 was the most common combat discipline a Jedi could learn. However, it gradually got phased out due to the emergence of blaster-based weapons becoming more and more common, rendering Makashi obsolete in the eyes of most Jedi. This only caused Dooku's choice to specialize in Makashi to be considered both unconventional and extremely rare. Dooku had also refined skill in the other 6 forms of lightsaber combat, and could serve as an instructor for any of them, and built his skill sets to be able to counter all of them if need be. While Dooku did have the capabilities of using other forms, he viewed the use of hybridized styles and techniques with disdain, considering it to compromise a duelist's overall skill by spreading themselves too thin on many disciplines. While it could be said that his knowledge of the other forms did influence his personal style, even if unconsciously, Dooku never actively employed any other style other than pure Makashi within live combat. Accordingly, Dooku used his own personalized technique to take the capabilities and core elements of Makashi to the absolute maximum level. Dooku utilized a linear cut and thrust style that prioritized precision, fluidity, control, and energy conservation. One of Makashi's greatest strengths was how conservative it was, with little physical exertion being required to employ the discipline effectively. This made the style perfectly suited for Dooku, and allowed him to further compensate for his advanced age. Dooku was noted to be so relaxed when fighting that observers even described him as if he was dancing during his engagements. One element of Makashi's discipline that Dooku strongly adhered to was the development of unique movesets in order to avoid predictability. Dooku had been able to take Makashi to such a high degree that he was even able to transcend many of its greatest weaknesses as a style. He was highly effective on the battlefield and was able to take on multiple opponents with little difficulty, and was even able to overcome one of Makashi's most consistent shortcomings through performing blast deflection. However, Dooku did have notable shortcomings in trying to meet opponents head-to-head, and had instead opted to take the path of least resistance, using lateral movements to keep himself out of his opponent's line of attack while also keeping them in his. Dooku built his offensive to work to bypass and undermine the defenses of his opponents, rather than overwhelm it outright. Meanwhile, Dooku built his defense to deflect and evade enemy strikes rather than attempting to stonewall them. Something worth noting about Count Dooku is that he rarely assumed an offensive or defensive posture, and instead rotated consistently between an advance and retreat moveset. This technique allowed him to avoid head-on engagements by not allowing his opponents to form an offensive or defensive foothold. Dooku had also been refined in integrating force and physical attacks within his lightsaber sequences, using telekinesis to bypass the enemy's defenses and leave more lines open for attack. This added to Dooku's strategy of creating diversionary attacks and opposing psychological warfare to undermine his opponent's defenses. As a built complement to Dooku's approach to lightsaber combat, Dooku built himself a curved tilt lightsaber that was equipped with a dual phase function that enabled him to shorten the blade into a SWTOR. As a Jedi, Dooku had a blue Ilum crystal as the focusing lens. However, after becoming Darth Tyrannus, Dooku would exchange his blue crystal for a red synthetic crystal, which provided him greater cutting power at the expense of maneuverability. Overall, Dooku's approach to lightsaber combat was a direct reflection of both his greatest strengths, but also his most crippling weaknesses. When Dooku is able to hold the initiative, keep his opponents off balance, and prevent his opponents from bringing their full power to bear, he is extremely precise and lethal. However, the main reason Dooku built his technique the way he did in avoiding head-on engagements was because of his inability to handle head-to-head engagements, especially given his old age. As his final duel with Anakin Skywalker showcased, when Dooku is cornered with no control or escape, he crumbles under the pressure. In conclusion, while Dooku does suffer some serious weaknesses, they should not be viewed as a detraction from his skills or effectiveness. Count Dooku is one of the greatest duelists in galactic history, the ultimate prodigy and refiner of Makashi, engaged some of the greatest warriors within the Jedi Order, and has only barely fallen short as the greatest swordmaster of his era. In the end, Count Dooku did not contain the power of a Rancor nor the speed of a Kaidu, but possessed the precision of a serpent who through every aspect of his style, technique, and discipline would make his enemies suffer the death of 1,000 cuts.
If you are to succeed in combat against the best of the Jedi, you must have fear, surprise, and intimidation on your side. For if any one element is lacking, it would be best for you to retreat. You must break them before you engage them. Only then will you ensure victory and have your trophy.
Luke Skywalker originally wielded his father's lightsaber, but lost the weapon during his confrontation with Vader on Bespin, forcing him to construct his own weapon. Using the entries in the Journal of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke's lightsaber closely followed the design of Kenobi's, with the traditional crystal harvesting sites either razed or blockaded by the Galactic Empire. Luke was forced to create a synthetic gem. Crafted to match the performance of an Ilum crystal, the green blade provided a solid balance between cutting power and mobility. In regards to his personalized technique, Luke was a master of Gem So, the dueling-centric variant of Form 5 lightsaber combat. His practice of this technique was built off his indirect and instinctual imitation of Darth Vader's method, rather than formal study, being a reasonable approximation rather than true to form, something that Luke has freely admitted. The influence of his father allowed him to build himself into a conservative yet well-rounded duelist, taking the best aspects of Vader's style, but also taking advantage of the fact that he wasn't held back with the same weaknesses as his father, possessing natural talent and skill, but never assuming that he would come up against an opponent more skilled than him. Luke supplemented his personal technique with a master-level application of Form 4 Taru, taught to him by Grandmaster Yoda during his tenure on Dagobah, adhering to its core principles of using the entire body as a weapon rather than relying solely on the blade, incorporating and demonstrating unarmed physical strikes and the physical aspects of the blade work into his sequences. He further incorporated Sarisu into his personal technique, using it primarily for blast deflection and defense, and demonstrated skill with Xi'an-based targeting deflections. Additionally, he was adept in the use of Jarkai dual-blade fencing, a skill he developed in order to combat the light whip wielded by the Dark Lady Lumaya, typically wielding a red Shoto as his offhand weapon. Lastly, Luke was a master of incorporating and chaining force attacks into his lightsaber sequences, a skill derived from the Nine-Man form, though it is unknown if he actively studied Nine-Man. As a martial combatant, Luke Skywalker took the skill set of Anakin Skywalker and applied it with the tactical mentality of Obi-Wan Kenobi, being able to remain versatile and adaptable despite specializing in a single form, balancing between a variety of skills rather than allocating to a single tree branch. He may not boast the same might as his father, or the unbeatable defense of Kenobi, or the agility of Yoda, or even ironically, the dexterity and efficiency of Dooku, but he wasn't far behind any of them. The underlying mentality of Luke's personal technique was his adherence to the Form 5 maxim, peace through superior firepower, where the goal was to achieve victory through assertive action, though not necessarily through violence, balancing out the domineering aspects of Form 5 with patience and understanding. While Luke was perfectly willing to cut loose, he generally fought with restraint. His best tactic was to undermine the opponent's resolve and will to fight with psychological warfare, in order to consent a surrender, or more optimally, contribute to his cause. It should be stated, however, that Luke was not a purely psychological fighter, and he knows how to approach those who refuse to play ball. He was adept at using his environment to his advantage for tactical purposes. He was adept at using deception and misdirection to lull his enemies into his false sense of security and to undermine them, and he had no qualms with using fear as a weapon. Luke Skywalker is perfectly capable of overpowering foes with his decisive offensive technique. Failing that, he can endure prolonged assaults with his staunch defense. Failing that, he can swiftly outflank an opponent with his agility and acrobatics. And when all those fail, he can blast you back with an expertly integrated force blast. At this point as a Jedi, Luke was not the master of any one singular skill, but a master with a variety of skills. And ultimately, what could be considered his greatest asset as a combatant is his will to fight. He will never give up, he will never back down. As martial combatants, both Count Dooku and Luke Skywalker are highly skilled and refined swordsmen that maintained a high degree of versatility despite specializing in singular forms, both being reigning master swordsmen of their respective eras and both being natural talents with the lightsaber.
Dooku's mastery of Makashi gives him a technical advantage over Luke, but Luke's self-trained Djemso technique makes up for the difference, as he wasn't formally trained like so many other Jedi during Dooku's era, and his ability to adapt on the fly and change techniques would make him difficult to undermine. Dooku's use of psychological warfare wouldn't get him anywhere, either due to them being the exact same tactics used by Luke himself, or because they rely on pre-existing knowledge of the combatant to undermine their resolve. It effectively makes this tactic useless, but more on that later. Furthermore, Dooku's success as a duelist was predicated on avoiding head-to-head engagements, in addition to his knowledge of the other forms. But since Luke can mix and match forms on the fly, it makes him dangerously unpredictable.
While the core of Luke's technique is pure Form 5, giving him a mechanical advantage over Dooku, this ultimately brings them to an impasse. Ditto with Force integration. Luke's skill with Jarkai isn't applicable, as Dooku is very well suited for dealing with Jarkai practitioners, and Luke only breaks out the Shoto for special occasions.
As such, we declare Count Dooku and Luke Skywalker equal as martial artists and lightsaber duelists. Much like his gifts with the blade, Dooku was a prodigy within the Force, and much like within lightsaber dueling, he took full advantage of this attribute. Dooku developed to become one of the most powerful Force wielders in the history of the Jedi Order. However, Dooku's fascination with Sith lore, combined with his continued growth of resentment against the Republic, drove him to the dark side. Upon becoming a Sith Lord, Count Dooku believed that he could control and utilize the dark side without succumbing to its corruptive influence, by remaining faithful to his principles as well as maintaining emotional discipline. However, in spite of this effort, the corrosive influence of Darth Sidious caused Dooku's ideals to be distorted, and his mind to be far more ruthless and borderline psychopathic. While this did turn Dooku into a self-serving tyrant, it also strengthened his growth and development as a Sith Lord, enabling him to leverage the power of the dark side in a magnitude he otherwise would not have been able to achieve. During his time as a Jedi, Dooku was already a master of telekinesis, and instructed classes on how to best utilize it. However, as a Sith, Dooku had been able to turn his skill with telekinesis into a horrifying instrument of power. Basic pushes and shoves allowed Dooku to thrash and manhandle opposing targets, and had even pulled a Jedi directly into his lightsaber blade during a duel. Dooku also displayed an advanced application of Force Grip, which he used to choke enemies out, make use of loose objects as environmental weapons, and even accomplish personal levitation. Much like his lightsaber technique, Dooku focused the range of his powers on precision and control over blunt force, though Dooku has showcased that he can overwhelm opponents with sheer magnitude when the situation called for it. Dooku has also been able to unleash force waves that are capable of scattering large groups of enemies, and shoving objects as large as starships with only minor difficulty. Dooku had also possessed strong defenses against other force wielders of similar magnitude, being capable of either evading the telekinetic assault or tanking the hit outright with his impressive force barrier. Offensively, Dooku has been able to reliably penetrate the force defenses of opposing force wielders, and has been able to win through ragdolling his opponent on more than one occasion. His growth as a Sith Lord had also allowed Dooku to gain the power of Force Lightning. While not as powerful as his master's use of it, Dooku could generate lightning against both single and multiple opponents that could kill or incapacitate on impact, though more often than not, Dooku had favored the use of lightning as an instrument of torture. To complement this, Dooku had displayed that he was capable of using Tutamenis, a power that enabled force wielders to absorb and redirect energy. Dooku had been showcased of being capable of using the ability to at least his own magnitude of force lightning, and presumably had been able to deflect blaster bolts with it. On top of the many combative abilities at Dooku's disposal, Dooku had also held possession of many utility-based force powers. For starters, Dooku is familiar with the use of Sith sorcery and has participated in many Sith rituals with Darth Sidious. Dooku was also an advanced telepath, and held the ability to influence the minds of weak-willed subjects, and control the minds of beasts and animals, such as when he tamed a krayt dragon, and effectively made use of it like a pet. Dooku also had a moderate refinement within Force concealment, allowing him to hide his Force signature from other adepts, though in Dooku's case, he could still be discovered by those who were actively looking for him. As a final note, Dooku has been able to use the Force to cleanse his body of poisons and diseases, such as when he cleansed himself of the Keratos Plague after Jango Fett exposed him to it to gain leverage over him. Although Dooku had failed to properly cleanse the Night Sister poison that dulled his senses, it is worth noting this strike both happened while Dooku was sleeping, and that Dooku did not have time to gather his energies for the cleansing, as he was attacked almost immediately afterwards. As far as physical augmentation was concerned, he mostly used it as compensation for his age. Overall, Count Dooku's applications with the Force were geared towards utility, precision, and control over blunt power, operating more as a man with a large toolbox rather than relying solely on the biggest hammer. While this made Dooku's application of the Force a lot more settled, it also made him far more dangerous, as most opponents would not know what abilities Dooku could muster against them until it was far too late. And because his technique with the Force was very similar to his technique with a lightsaber, it enabled him to use the Force to be extremely complementary to his skills with the blade. While he does have limits on how far he can push his Force energies before giving out, it is worth noting that the only two beings that pushed Dooku to completely run out of reserves were Grandmaster Yoda and Anakin Skywalker, the two most powerful Jedi within the Order by the time of his death. To conclude, Dooku's use of the Force was similar to a surgeon. In most cases, he would not overwhelm you outright, but he would ensure that you remain off balance and fearful of the next ability he could muster. He was not a boulder seeking to crush you, he was a river seeking to drown you.
As Obi-Wan's apprentice, Luke Skywalker's first lesson was to reach out with his feelings and harmonize with the Force. This skill was instrumental in his early development, allowing him to quickly master blast deflection, and allowed him to destroy the first Death Star during the Battle of Yavin. Instead of relying on his X-Wing's targeting computer, he put his faith in the Force and performed the impossible, firing a proton torpedo down the station's reactor shaft and ultimately destroying the station. Probably the best example of Luke's willingness to surrender himself to the Force was during his bout with Darth Vader on Mimban, where he channeled the spirit of Obi-Wan Kenobi, which granted him access to powers beyond his level at that time and allowed him to narrowly defeat Vader. Without this enhancement, though, he struggled to employ Force abilities, needing to muster his full concentration to perform basic telekinesis. All this changed when he began his training under Grandmaster Yoda. During his bout on Dagobah, he learned to enhance his physical abilities with the Force, allowing him to employ acrobatics and enhance his strength to the point where he could override the superhuman strength of Darth Vader, with his initial training regime being marathon runs through the Dagobah swamps, with Yoda riding piggyback. His initial tutelage with telekinesis involved lifting several objects while in meditation, and he was able to employ basic telekinesis easily. When Luke's abilities fully bloomed, his telekinetic output was sufficient to destroy an Imperial walker. He also demonstrated an ability to penetrate the barriers of other adepts, catching the reborn Emperor by surprise with a telekinetic shove. However, Luke's approach to the Force was based around a delicate touch rather than sheer force, best expressed in his use of telepathy. Basic mind tricks allowed him to defuse hostile situations, or gain access to restricted areas or beings. Rather than issuing commands, he's offering suggestions. Rather than dominating, he's inclining towards consent. For defense, Luke did possess knowledge of Tooth and how to conjure active Force shields. His own barriers were strong enough to deflect fire from an Imperial walker. His approach, though, was based on cancelling out the momentum rather than overpowering other Force wielders. This proved instrumental in neutralizing telekinetic attacks and other specific Force abilities. His ability to defend against lightning, however, was limited, only able to deflect moderate bursts like Count Dooku's or Darth Bane's, but he was unable to defend against Darth Sidious's. This doesn't reflect badly on Luke, though, as surviving, much less defending against Palpatine's lightning, even for a brief time, still speaks to a high degree of Force potential. Like Vader, Luke did possess a darkness that he could use to call upon as Force Rage to enhance his physical performance. As Palpatine's apprentice, Luke did learn about Sith lore and powers, though only in the field of abstraction, as Palpatine was fully aware of Luke's intent and didn't want to give him anything of substance. However, Luke did learn basic Sith alchemy, creating a pair of sentinels from his own DNA, and his powers of mental influence were heightened, commanding the Revenant forces through fear and creating lifelike Force illusions. Though Luke preferred using his Force abilities in a non-lethal manner, he was perfectly willing to kill with them if necessary, dispatching several Nagri with a lightsaber throw, or influencing a large object to crush several enemies. Luke's greatest power as a Force wielder was his use of Force harmony, syncing his mind with his sister Leia in order to defeat Palpatine's influence over him. and eventually to employ Sever Force, which caused the Sith Lord to lose control over the Force storm he had created. Though Luke was almost lost to the dark side, this stemmed from his willingness to confront it alone, which isn't to suggest that he was weak on a personal level, but the power of the Jedi has always come from their ability to work together. But unlike the Knights of old, Luke Skywalker understood the dangers of the shadow and was not afraid of its darkness. As Force wielders, both Count Dooku and Luke Skywalker are very similar in their range of abilities and in their application, but their tactics were very different from each other.
Dooku's approach to the Force was based around using it to undermine his opponent in an offensive manner, steadily breaking their defenses with a needle rather than a cleaver. Much like a Master of Doom monk, Dooku used his powers for the purpose of fear, surprise, and intimidation. The Revenge of the Sith novelization describes him as channeling the dark side along an axis towards him, driving the Jedi's blade into his, allowing him to control the nature of the fight and prevent his opponents from bringing their Force abilities to bear against him.
Going through their abilities side by side, both use Force augmentation to bolster their capabilities for use of their respective fighting styles, but they went down very different roads. Dooku's use of Force augmentation was centered around making up for his lackluster stamina, funneling it into agility and dexterity. By contrast, Luke was more balanced across the board, employing it conservatively based on the demands of the situation.
For sensibilities, Dooku's ability to cloak himself means he can certainly ambush Luke, but Luke's innate insight makes up for this, which would allow him to sense Dooku's shimmer and put himself on guard against such an attack. As telekinetics, they share a similar magnitude, but Dooku employs his powers more actively and creatively within this field, while Luke mainly uses his powers defensively to cancel out Force momentum. And while he can penetrate the defenses of other adepts, Dooku's barrier would be able to hold up. Telekinetic strangulation and Force throws would get Dooku nowhere, as Luke is able to defend against Force choke and would immediately send any flying objects back at the Count.
Luke's skill with Sith alchemy and Force illusions isn't applicable, as it is abstract in nature and can only be applied off the battlefield. Addressing Dooku's lightning against Luke's skill with Two Towers and his Force shields, Luke can redirect the burst, but he can't absorb it. And if his shield can withstand turbo laser fire, it can hold up to Dooku's lightning, if only briefly, and Luke still has his lightsaber. As a result of this impasse, the field that moves the advantage to Dooku's corner is knowledge base, experience against other Force wielders, and innate power. At this point in his career, Luke could be compared to a mid-tier Jedi Master as far as skill with the Force is concerned, and though he's liberal about his use of the Force, he only applies it defensively, which means his ability to retaliate against other Force attacks wouldn't get him very far.
Count Dooku gets the edge and Force abilities. And now for our first ever collaborative narrative style verdict.
Are you fucking joking? It took me 6 weeks to write and finish the last script, and that was just Malik and Daraj. Plus I already used that joke in my last verses. Summary only, thank you very much.
Alright, instead, here's how we would sum up this verdict. What makes this contest one of great significance is how both combatants built themselves into nearly completely opposite training styles and philosophies. Dooku built all of his skills, techniques, and knowledge through taking the conventional and building it to perfection. Meanwhile, Luke, due to the circumstances he lived in and the limited ability to be taught by other Force wielders, was required to learn through secondhand teachings and experiences during the Galactic Civil War and after. To sum up all their attributes, Luke is without question the better physical specimen, but Dooku's force enhancements does allow him to compete on equal footing, even if only for a limited time. As duelist, Dooku is undoubtedly the more skilled and refined out of the two, having over 60 years of training and combat experience under his belt, and has dealt with top-tier opponents more consistently than Luke. But because Luke was trained unconventionally, Dooku would have difficulty predicting him. Luke also has the benefit of employing a combat style that has been proven to put the count under serious strain. It is an overall impasse. As Force wielders, Luke Skywalker is, without question, the more powerful Force wielder of the two, possessing raw Force power that was equal or greater to that of Darth Vader, who has been stated to be more powerful than Dooku by many sources. However, Luke's lack of range and his unwillingness to commit to using the full extent of his powers under fear of falling to the dark side does give Dooku the slight supremacy, given that Dooku has far greater control, more variety, and is more willing to use said abilities in a combative manner.
The closest analog for a fight between these two combatants would be a combination of the bout between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda versus Dooku in the Geonosian hangar in Episode 2, and Anakin's fight with Dooku aboard the Invisible Hand in Episode 3. Dooku would initially sense Luke's strength in the Force and mistake him for Anakin before visually spotting him. Confident he can defeat this foe, Dooku would initially lean on his skill in Makashi to undermine Luke's guard, with both fighters playing it cautiously and probing each other's defenses. After an initial trade of blows, Dooku would start breaking out the Force abilities and employing Dun Mok from multiple angles, slowly reading Luke's thoughts and discovering who he really is, but Luke will be prepared for Dooku's use of Dun Mok. As we all know, Luke has had to deal with Dun Mok in a similar manner to Dooku's by means of Vader, so unless Dooku can really get under Luke's skin, Dun Mok is basically going to be useless. Furthermore, it relies heavily on either probing one's thoughts or pre-existing knowledge, and if pushed too far, Luke can easily overwhelm Dooku's guard. That said, Dooku's developed skill in Makashi and his knowledge of the other forms affords him a technical advantage that would allow him to pose a serious threat to Luke, but unfortunately it affords him very little as Luke's technique was a self-taught imitation rather than adherence to formal training, which means Dooku's skill with pattern recognition affords him very little.
The mid-fight is where we believe Dooku has the best chance of winning, as he can capitalize on his technical skill and employ his more developed Force abilities, and slip inside Luke's guard to deliver a lethal blow. But Luke's defensive powers cancel this out, though at this point in his life his knowledge of Tutumenes is only at a blaster level. His Force shield is more than sufficient to compensate, and if it can hold up under AT-AT fire, it can stand up to Dooku's lightning, if only for a brief time.
Luke's skill with Gemso, Sarisu, and Itaru also affords him a much stronger mechanical advantage over Dooku's singular Makashi form, as rather than simply supplementing each other, Luke's use of forms 3, 4, and 5 complement each other and compensate for each other's weaknesses. That, and if his base Gemso is unable to beat Dooku, he can simply switch up techniques on the fly and change tack completely, which would not only make it difficult for Dooku to get a read on him, but it would mirror his final duel against Obi-Wan and Anakin.
While it is possible that Dooku may attempt to create an opening in order to secure his escape, this is unlikely to work without Luke having one of his friends or family present, as Luke would not lower his guard unless in service to saving his allies. By this point, the late fight is where Dooku will start to burn out, and Luke will press his advantage either by means of a clever feint, a subtle shift within tactics, a blatant undermine or overpowerment of Dooku's defenses, or switching over to another technique in order to avoid becoming predictable.
What this fight comes down to is whether or not Dooku's superior combat experience and Force abilities would be enough to overwhelm Luke before Luke can win out in the war of attrition. In our opinion, the answer is no. Luke has gone against an opponent who arguably uses the same kind of tactics as Dooku but even more effective, and has even eventually beaten said opponent. While comparing Vader and Dooku is not a one-for-one comparison given Vader's different style and his own psychological baggage / alternate agenda when facing Luke, Vader has employed the same kind of tactics to wear opponents down, and that would mean Luke has experience dealing with such tactics.
Eventually, Luke would disarm Dooku, leaving the vulnerable aristocrat one less limb and with a lightsaber blade to his throat.
And as such, we declare Luke Skywalker the victor.
And of course, everyone just bear in mind, this is all just our opinion. Feel free to chime in your opinions within the comments below, and tell us who you think would win. Ultimately, just remember guys, please keep things civil, and if anyone has any recommendations on what kind of versus content should be made in the future, please leave it within the comments below of this video. Also, if anyone's further interested within this content, either check out more of Deadponic's channel here, or check out my channel, which the link will be included in the description below. It better be Deadponic. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, peace out.